Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to CBHN's Health for Life series on prediabetes and prevention. My name is Amber Busby. I'm the Associate Program Manager at the California Black Health Network. Today, we are here for session 4 of the 7-part series, Control the Controllable. We have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Candice A. Price, who I will introduce momentarily. Dr. Price will lead us in a discussion on the importance of regular exercise and fitness as it relates to diabetes prevention efforts. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. While this webinar is designed to be interactive, throughout this session, you will be muted. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature for comments or questions and/or to put any questions in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share a little bit about CBHN in case any attendees are unfamiliar with our organization. The California Black Health Network's vision is the California where every African American and Black immigrant has the opportunity to live long, healthy lives, free from violence, racism, and health inequities, regardless of their education, socioeconomic class, zip code, sexual orientation, gender identity, housing or immigration status, and have access to high quality and equitable primary and behavioral health care. We do this through outreach, education, policy, and advocacy work. At this time, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Candice Price, who is a metabolism and nutrition scientist. Her career has focused on understanding the development and prevention of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. She received her PhD in endocrinology at UC Berkeley, where she studied alternate day fasting and the role of fat cells in the development of insulin resistance. During her time as an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, Dr. Price investigated the mechanisms by which sugar-sweetened beverage consumption increases the risk for cardiometabolic disease in Black women. Her research portfolio also included examining the impact of naturally sweetened juice intake on health outcomes, the role of the gut microbiome and insulin resistance, psychological stress and sugar consumption, and the potential epigenetic effects of high sugar intake. In addition to her scientific career, Dr. Price is a certified diabetes prevention program coach and started one of the few DPP programs in the Sacramento region. With that said, I am pleased to turn it over to Dr. Candice A. Price. Thank you for being with us today.
Wonderful, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So give me 1 minute while I pull up my presentation here. Okay, so as you all know, today is all about exercise for the prevention of type 2 diabetes. So before we get started, we are going to find out what you all know about physical activity and preventing type 2 diabetes. Ambria, can you go ahead and launch the survey? Okay, so as long as I'm either eating a healthy diet or exercising regularly, I'm doing what my body needs to prevent cardiometabolic disease. It's not necessary to have both a regularly healthy diet and exercise to prevent disease. Is this true or false? Okay, so some of you think this is true, most of you think this is false. All right, well, let's find out for the next question. The physical activity guidelines for Americans recommends how many minutes of physical activity per day? 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 75 minutes, or 150 minutes? All right, so most of you think that the recommendation is 30 minutes per day. I hope that means that most of you attended webinar 2. All right, next question. Light physical activity does not count towards the recommended number of minutes of total physical activity per day. Is this true or false? Light physical activity. Okay, some of you think this is true, and most of you think this is false. All right, we'll find out today. Next question. Oh, is that the last one?
Last question.
Okay. Okay, the recommended 30 minutes of daily moderate exercise must be in the form of one continuous 30 minutes of exercise. Is this true or false? Okay. Some of you think this is true. Most of you think this is false. All right. So today, what I hope you will take away is understanding the link between physical activity and type 2 diabetes risk, understanding the recommendations for physical activity, knowing what it means to do moderate or vigorous activity. And then we're going to spend half of our time talking about barriers to getting enough physical activity, potential solutions to addressing these barriers, and then I'll provide some resources as well and some other tips that you can use to reach your daily physical activity goals. So what I'm showing you here is a map of sedentary behavior across the United States. It ranges from those states that report, low sedentary individuals versus those that have high prevalence of sedentary individuals. This is specific to Black Americans. This was data that was generated from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System study, which was a study that specifically looked at Black health. And you can see that many of the states in which there's a high prevalence of Black Americans that have essentially no physical activity are concentrated in the southern states and some in the Midwest as well. And in general, you can see that there aren't any states really, maybe a couple, but most people in the United States are not meeting our physical activity guidelines. Interestingly, physical inactivity mirrors diabetes prevalence. This is not a coincidence. Now, granted, the map on the right is specific to Black Americans, whereas the map on the left is specific to Black Americans, whereas the map on the right takes into account all race and ethnic groups and type 2 diabetes prevalence. But keep in mind that Blacks have a disproportionately higher prevalence of diabetes. And so this mirroring still, we would expect to see similar results if the map on the right displaying type 2 diabetes prevalence was just focused on Blacks. We know that there's a high connection between physical activity and diabetes prevalence, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we get into really understanding what the recommendations are and why physical activity is so important, I want to take a step back and have us understand sort of why, as humans, why physical activity might be necessary for just our survival. So remember, way back, humans were created to be hunters and gatherers, right? This required vigorous physical activity. And because of that, we burned a lot of calories. So we were actually, from an evolutionary standpoint, humans were created to burn a lot of calories on a daily basis, right? Because they had to go out on long walks and hikes for several miles to find food. And then they had to carry that food back, which could be, hundreds of pounds of meat, for example. And so this was daily, survival was a daily physical challenge. Now humans have evolved to having a more sedentary lifestyle because we no longer have to go out and hunt and gather. our hunting and gathering is in the form of grocery shopping, right? And oftentimes we drive to the grocery store rather than walking to the grocery store. So we spend a lot of time sitting. We spend a lot of time sitting at our desk or sitting in our car. We're not often walking or even running long distances. Part of this is also attributed to the neighborhoods that we live in and the structure and the dynamics of that. If we don't live in a neighborhood that even has a grocery store in walking distance, then we obviously don't even have the option to walk to the grocery store. But also, I think we've been conditioned to often drive places rather than walk, even if we do live in a place that is walking distance to do some of our daily tasks, right? Then, of course, there's things like fast food in our neighborhoods. So we've got easy access to food, both at the grocery store, but also already prepared food that is low in nutrients and high in calories, which we talked about in the previous webinar. And so our bodies are built to burn calories, but we're not actually living that lifestyle of burning calories because everything is so much more convenient right now. And so why is this even important? Well, exercising is all about maintaining our energy balance. This means the food that we take in, the calories that we take in, has to be balanced with the calories that we are burning. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see in the middle, it's weight stability. This is when you are essentially, the calories that you're consuming are matching the calories that you're putting out, right? So this includes the calories that you're burning just by sitting down, the calories that you're burning standing up, and the calories that you're burning by doing physical activity. Now, weight gain occurs when you're eating too many calories, right? Because you're gaining weight and you're eating too many calories more than you're burning, right? You're not doing the physical activity to match the calories that you're consuming. So think about, retired athletes, or even yourself, if you played a sport back in high school, you maybe have been an athlete and you were working out regularly. You graduate and you no longer play on that sports team, but maybe you're consuming the same amount of calories, but you're not working out and you're not burning those calories off, and that can lead to weight gain. Weight loss, on the other hand, occurs when the calories that you're burning exceeds the calories that you're taking in. So this is, of course, what calorie restriction is all about, when we're reducing our calories that we actually would need to maintain our body weight. We're eating less so that we can lose that weight. So physical activity and meeting our physical activity guidelines is really about being able to maintain our weight, or in some cases, being able to lose weight. Now, in some extreme cases, weight gain, but we're not going to talk about that today. So physical activity, there's different levels of physical activity: high, average, and low, right? Many of us are in this low category. We're sitting all day. Maybe we're going for a very short walk, maybe because we have to walk our dogs, but we're not really getting up and moving, right? And then average physical activity, is sort of what we consider moderate, and I'll talk about that some more. And then high activity levels, what we think about when we're talking about more vigorous activity. So partaking in regular physical activity reduces your risk for type 2 diabetes because it helps to improve your metabolism. Okay, so one of the ways it does this is by lowering your blood glucose levels. It improves insulin sensitivity, promotes healthy fat deposition. So if you recall, in a couple of other webinars, I talked about visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat. And visceral fat's that fat that's around our organs. It's the fat that we don't want. It's the unhealthy fat, and it's associated with an increased risk for diabetes and other cardiometabolic diseases. Of course, building muscle and strength, which also aids in glucose metabolism, improving glucose metabolism, and maintaining efficient glucose metabolism. And of course, all that together helps to prevent unhealthy weight gain. We also know that there's a beneficial effect on our mood, right? It boosts our energy. It reduces our blood pressure. It increases dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine, these are the good feel-good hormones. improves sleep quality. We'll talk about sleep in the next webinar. And increases longevity and, of course, makes for a healthier aging. Now, as we go through our webinar today, I've got a little bit of a surprise for you all. We're going to do some exercises. This is just to demonstrate how you can be more active throughout your day, especially if you have a desk job and maybe you're just sitting all day. You know, what are some creative ways you can get up and move your body, right? So right now, if you are in a place where you're able to stand up, you can also do the sitting down. I want you to put your arms out and I want you to rotate them in circles going forward. And I want you to do that for about, let's say, 30 or 20 times on each side, and then go in the reverse direction 20 times the other side. I want you to do that while I'm talking about the next slide. Once I go through the next slide, you can put your arms down. Okay, and also just for fun reference, I'm standing while I'm giving this presentation. So those are other ways you can also incorporate being more active throughout the day and not just being sedentary. Okay, so let's talk about the recommendations. So the physical activity guidelines for Americans recommends that we partake in 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per day, 5 days a week. Okay, so to be more specific about this, when the guidelines are really referring to moderate aerobic physical activity for a total of 150 to 300 minutes a week. Of course, the more minutes you achieve, the better, right? You can never, well, I guess you could do too much, but generally speaking, the more physical activity, the better. Or if you are someone that partakes in more vigorous activity, vigorous aerobic activity, that is, then the recommendation is 75 to 150 minutes per week. So essentially, if you work harder, do harder workouts, you don't have to spend as much time to still meet that recommendation. Okay, you can also do a combination of the two, of a combination of moderate or vigorous aerobic physical activity at 75 to 150 minutes per week recommendation. In addition to the aerobic physical activity, they've also added muscle strengthening activities of moderate or greater intensity that involve all major muscle groups. You would want to do this 2 or more days per week. Now, I mentioned before that a lot of Americans are not meeting these guidelines. For Blacks specifically, again, referring to the study, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System study that I talked about with that map that I showed you before, less than 40% of Black adults are between the ages of 45 and 64 are meeting these recommendations of moderate to vigorous activity. And then in young adults, young Black adults between the ages of 18 to 24, only 6.3% were found to meet the physical activity recommendations. So that is a dire, sad situation. We are not allowing our youth and our young adults to partake in physical activity that helps set them up for a healthier aging. And, you know, this starts off at a young age, and, you know, part of the issue with, you know, taking away physical activity programs in these schools is we're really setting our children up to live less healthy lives as they get older. Now, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the majority of us are not meeting physical activity guidelines when we look at by gender. So in Black women, only 40.7% of us are meeting these physical activity guidelines. And amongst Black men, only 47.7% are meeting these guidelines. When we look at gender differences by race and ethnic groups, we can see here I've circled Black women have the lowest prevalence of us are meeting the physical activity recommendations. Only 16%, or 16.5% of us are meeting these guidelines for both aerobic and muscle strengthening activities. So the data that I showed you before was for total physical activity. This is specifically for aerobic and muscle strengthening activities. So we have a lot of work to do. And, you know, this is a really important point because Black women have the highest prevalence of hypertension and cardiovascular mortality. And we have a disproportionately higher prevalence of type 2 diabetes. We know that type 2 diabetes is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and in fact, is the #1 killer for for Black women, but also for Black women with type 2 diabetes. So it's really critical that we start implementing more physical activity throughout our daily lives, especially if we are at risk for type 2 diabetes or already have type 2 diabetes. Okay, so let's talk about some examples of moderate and vigorous exercise so you can get a better understanding of what that really means. So the different levels of exercise, light, moderate, and vigorous, is measured based on something called the metabolic equivalence, or METs for short. Okay, so when we sit, that's equivalent to 1 MET. And so in the moderate and vigorous activity category, you notice that for moderate, it's 3 to 6 METs. Vigorous activity meets at least 6 METs, sometimes more, right? So that basically means that compared to sitting down, we're burning for moderate activity 3 to 6 times more calories than we would be burning if we were sitting. And for vigorous activity, we're burning at least 6 times more calories. Now for light activity, we're burning less than 3 times the calories that we would be burning as if we were sitting. So if you notice in the definition of the recommendations, it's focused on partaking in moderate and vigorous activity. So light activity is actually not part of the guidelines. However, it's still getting our bodies up and moving. So while there's a heavy emphasis on partaking in moderate and vigorous activity, I also want to make the point that it's also about reducing sedentary activity. So even if you are even if you're meeting the moderate and vigorous activity, you also want to make sure that you're not being too sedentary throughout the rest of your time during the day. So maybe instead of sitting, you might want to try standing while you're working or watching TV, for example, or maybe you can park on the other side of the parking lot and walk to the entrance of the store. We're not burning a lot of calories in that, but we are still moving our bodies and not being so sedentary. Okay, so here's another movement break. I want you all to march in place. I don't think any instructions are needed for that. We all know how to march, but I will say put your arms up. You get the most bang for your buck when you use your arms while you're marching in place. And I want you to march in place for the duration of the next 2 slides. Okay, so when we talk about aerobic exercise, I just wanted to make the point of this is exercise that is continuous and rhythmic in nature. You can do it for an extended period of time. And then there's anaerobic exercise. This is exercise that's more intense. It tends to be in the vigorous intensity level. So things like muscle strength building, weightlifting and things like that, or sprinting are some examples of anaerobic exercise. Now, the reason why it's called aerobic exercise is because your cells require oxygen to burn off the carbohydrates and the fat. For anaerobic exercise, your cells don't need oxygen to burn off those carbohydrates, but because your body has a limited supply of stored carbohydrates, then you can once that stored carbohydrates is used up, your body starts burning other types of fuel called lactic acid. And so that's what causes that burning in your muscles. And so that's why anaerobic exercises you can't do for an extended period of time. But partaking in both aerobic and anaerobic exercise is optimal for achieving optimal health, as well as if your goal is to lose weight, you really want to participate in both aerobic as well as anaerobic exercise. So again, some examples of aerobic activity might be what you immediately might think about is aerobic step exercises, right? Then of course there's cycling, there's running, of course, and also swimming. Anaerobic activities would include things like weightlifting, I mentioned, sprinting, jumping rope, climbing, like rock climbing, or doing interval trainings. There's something called the high intensity interval training. These are like short bouts of exercise, of really high intensity exercises. And those are really great to get in those 30 minutes of vigorous activity, because you can do them, you can break it up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so there was a study that was conducted that wanted to determine if walking could still elicit the same benefits as vigorous physical activity. And we're talking about walking, I mean like moderately paced walking. And I bring this up because walking often gets recommended as a form of exercise that basically anybody can do, really, unless there's a physical limitation. But for the most part, it's a great way to get started if you're not someone that regularly exercises. And so they found out that women who regularly exercise at a moderate level of activity showed a reduced risk for type 2 diabetes by 32%. And in women who did vigorous physical activity, 31%. In women who did vigorous physical activity, their risk was reduced by almost half. Okay. So interestingly, they also found that fast-paced, vigorous walking, so greater than moderate walking. This is vigorous walking. So moderate walking would be like if you can walk a mile within, 15 minutes. So imagine if you can walk a little faster than that. They found that walking vigorously was independently associated with a 30% reduced risk for type 2 diabetes. So that means if vigorous walking was their only activity that they were doing as their physical activity, they were reducing their risk by 30%. Okay, so what does this look like? What does this fast-paced, moderate intensity walking look like? Okay, so I mentioned you should be able to walk, 15, 20 minutes, walk a mile in 15 or 20 minutes. So that would be the equivalent of 3 miles per hour. Of course, this also depends on how fit you are. And running, if you're going to run a mile, you should be able to run that mile within 10 minutes for it to count as vigorous activity. Now, the speed will depend on your age and your fitness level. If you're regularly fit, then a brisk walk at a moderate pace may not really get you to that moderate physical activity zone that you need. So you might have to be in more of a faster pace. So maybe try to walk that mile in 12 minutes instead of 15. Also, you should be able to speak in full sentences. If you can speak in full sentences, but it's a little bit harder, noticeably so, then you're in that moderate zone of intensity. Now, of course, if you have a heart rate monitor, that's also an ideal way to determine whether or not you're in the moderate or vigorous range. You should, at a moderate level of activity, you should be reaching 50% of your target heart rate. There are charts that you can find if you don't have a heart rate monitor that will tell you what your goal is based on whether or not you are partaking in moderate or vigorous activity. And it's really based on a percentage of your maximum heart rate for your specific age, right? So if you're in the 35 age range around there and you're partaking in, let's say, vigorous activity, then you want your heart rate to be somewhere between 138 and 156. Now, I mentioned before that, this is monitoring your heart rate and using that to determine your current level of activity is going to be dependent on your fitness level. And this is particularly true for individuals that aren't already regularly active. So if you are new to exercise, I do encourage you to get a heart rate monitor so that you can basically gauge where you are. Go try to walk that mile in 15 minutes. Can you do it in 15 minutes? And where does your heart rate fall when you do reach that goal? Okay, here's another movement break. So I want you to do some push-ups. Don't worry, just 10 push-ups is all I'm asking. You can do a different type. You can do the regular push-up on the floor, the incline push-ups, which is you might use like a step or something. This is a modified version, so it takes a little bit less pressure off of those arms. And then, of course, the most modified version is a wall push-up, which I always recommend to people who some people can't do any push-ups. So the wall push-up is the easiest one to do. And you just want to make sure that you're using your arms and not leaning your body into it, right? So it's all about really strengthening those arms. So I just want you to do 10 of those. Okay, now another way, aside from looking at your heart rate monitor, that you can tell if you're doing moderate or vigorous activity is the counting talk test. So I mentioned before, If you're doing moderate activity, you should be able to speak in complete sentences, but it should be a little uncomfortable, right? So if there's something actually called the counting talk test, this was a scientific study that was done to identify this method to help people figure out if they're partaking in moderate or vigorous activity. You do this when you're typically doing some aerobic activity of some kind. So if you're unable to talk comfortably while exercising, then you're likely doing vigorous activity and you're in that anaerobic zone. So things, again, like weightlifting, sprinting, or jumping rope. Okay, so to get down to some of the molecular mechanisms through which exercise is beneficial for protecting us against type 2 diabetes, I just want to just briefly introduce a couple of these. So exercise produces more mitochondria. So mitochondria is a part of something in our cell, is where most of our energy is produced. And we think of this as the powerhouse of our cell, right? It helps convert the energy, the nutrients that we're consuming from foods that's getting broken down, and we're using that as fuel. That mitochondria turns that fuel into energy. Okay. So physical activity, when we are regularly active at the moderate and vigorous levels, right? We're able to increase the number of our mitochondria in our tissues, right? So this improves our metabolism and our ability to become more efficient at not just taking up glucose and metabolizing that glucose, but also burning fat. So if you are losing weight or you're trying to burn more fat, gain more muscle, this is really important. And when we see a reduction in the number of mitochondria or even in the function of the mitochondria, then this can lead to insulin resistance. So we need the mitochondria to burn our glucose and our fat. And so when we have less of that available, then we end up having a slower metabolism and we're not able to efficiently metabolize our nutrients. And so by increasing our physical activity, we're increasing our mitochondrial availability and our function, and thereby increasing insulin sensitivity. And again, insulin sensitivity is how well your body responds to insulin, and as a result, how well your cells can take up the glucose in circulation and bring your glucose levels back to a normal range. Okay, speaking of bringing your glucose back to normal range and helping that glucose come into the cells to be metabolized, exercise activates something called the GLUT4. It's a glucose transporter, and we find this in our muscle cells as well as some other cells, but I'm mentioning muscle cells because it's one of our primary sites of glucose metabolism. And it's activated by insulin. So when insulin comes to the cell and it binds to its receptor, activates a cascade of other proteins and signals that will then tell the GLUT4 to go to the surface of the cell and bring that glucose in to be metabolized. So when we're exercising regularly, we're allowing our cells, we're encouraging our cells, promoting this transfer of GLUT4 to the cell surface to bring in our glucose. Okay. It does this by activating this AMPK, which I don't really need to talk about in detail, but I just want to mention that when we age, this activation can actually be decreased, and this is part of what contributes or can contribute to muscle weakness. So it's really important to continue our physical activity, especially as we're aging and getting older, because it helps with obviously maintaining strength and also our metabolism. All right, the next movement break is a lunge, a front lunge. You basically stand with your hips and straight, and then put your right leg down with your back left knee down towards the ground, but don't touch the ground, and then you lift back up, and you want to lift back up with your right heel. This can be a tough exercise, but try to do 8 of those on each leg. Okay, so now let's talk about our barriers to getting enough physical activity. So there's time, There's access to safe places to exercise. There's knowledge, knowing how to exercise. You've never done it before. You don't really even know where to start. Having the motivation. Okay, this is probably maybe even one of the number one barrier, maybe second to time, or maybe tied with time. And then of course, there's also personal physical barriers. So let's really talk about time first. So I often even tell myself this, I don't have time to get in my 30 minutes today. Okay, so how might you get around that barrier? Well, you can split up your workout. You can do 2 bouts of 15-minute workouts, right? So I mentioned earlier something called high intensity interval training. These are perfect for breaking up your workouts because you get in that vigorous activity, but in a short period of time. So maybe you might do that at the beginning of your day and then do it another 15 minutes at the end of your day. Earlier, I mentioned parking at the farthest end of the parking lot from the building entrance. So you're getting more steps in your day rather than trying to park at the closest spot to the door. If you take public transportation, get off one stop early and go for a brisk walk, so fast-paced walk the rest of the way to your destination. Can you walk while you're on a work call? So sometimes, in this day and age of more Zoom calls, sometimes we don't need to be on camera. We don't need to participate in the meeting. We don't need to look at any slides. We just have to listen in. Can you walk while you're listening in on that meeting? That really helps us to get around the time of, oh, I can't fit in any exercise at all because I work so many hours a day. And then at the end of the day, there's always things to do, right? Can you take the stairs instead of the elevator? So for many years, I used to have a no elevator policy, unless, of course, I was moving something. But otherwise, I had a strict policy for myself that I would only take the stairs. And it was a great way to just get in some activity without actually really putting too much effort into it. And this is really great, especially if you have stairs at home. You can use your stairs to incorporate exercise in the home. And we'll talk about that later too. And then exercising while we watch TV. Some of our shows are really long, right? There might be like a marathon you're watching, or some of these shows are like an hour or 2 hours long, kind of ridiculous. But can we spend some of that time exercising during commercial breaks, which is great because then you're timing yourself and trying to get in maybe 1 or 2 exercises before the show comes back on. So there's ways to be creative to get around our barrier of time. Now, one of the biggest barriers that's a little harder to manage is access. So one of the findings in the field is that Physical Activity Council states that average and higher income households are more physically active than low income households. Now, part of this might be knowledge, right? They might just have grown up with more examples of people that were physically active in their adulthood. But also it's about access, right? They probably can afford a gym membership or some of the latest at-home gym equipment, and thereby don't even need to leave the home to really get in vigorous workouts. So what are some potential solutions to this? So if you don't have access to a gym, or maybe your neighborhood isn't safe enough to take walks, are there other ways that you might be able to get around this? So one, does your health insurance provide reimbursements for gym memberships? Some of them do, so you should look into that. There's also programs through health insurance that you can utilize as well. Those can be really great, and I know some of them have them for older adults as well. Local community centers, YMCA, aquatic centers, sometimes community centers will have exercise classes that are lower cost. And then I mentioned having stairs at home. So one example of a workout in your own home, if you have stairs, might be running up and down, doing 3 sets for 5 minutes each, or walking up and down the stairs for 20 or 30 minutes, right? And these are things you can do simply at home, especially if you work from home. It's an easy thing to do, or first thing in the morning to start your day. If you have internet access at home, there are so many different exercise videos on YouTube. Some of these are free. Some of these do require a subscription, but they're typically not expensive. Then there's, of course, online classes through apps that do require a subscription, but they tend to be a little bit more expensive. But those are great because you're being guided by a professional. And if you do have access to a gym, and you've never worked out before, I would encourage trying to go attend a class where you can get access to a trainer that can make sure that you're using proper form, because without proper form, you can certainly injure yourself and you're not going to get the best benefit out of the exercises. Okay, relevant to many of us in California, it is too hot outside, especially in the summertime. So what might you do instead? Maybe you work out indoors. Maybe you work out earlier in the morning when it's cooler. Sometimes it cools down at night. You can do that too, as long as it's still light outside. You want to still be safe. Or can you go swimming? Sometimes some of our communities have aquatic centers, and the admission fee is not very expensive. So that's a really great exercise, especially if you have any sort of physical barriers. Swimming can be a really great workout. Okay, your next movement break is to do some jumping jacks. I want you to shoot for 50. If you can keep going, by all means, go for 100. Okay. Knowledge. I don't know what to do. Okay, so I've never worked out. I don't know where to start, and I don't know what to do. Okay, so search for online classes for beginners. These do exist. You want to start slow. Find a group class at your gym. See if, and maybe take a buddy with you so that you don't feel so intimidated. See if there's any exercise groups in your community. Find an experienced exercise accountability partner. This can help you to get more knowledge about what types of exercises you can do, and maybe have someone also coach you through doing that. And then, of course, if you have the ability, get a trainer. This really is great for making sure that you're using proper technique to prevent injuries. Okay, motivation. Many of us, even if we are the type to partake in physical activity regularly, oftentimes there is a day that comes where we just don't feel like doing it, right? We are not about the physical activity today. We are too tired. All we want to do is sit on the couch, watch our favorite show, and exercising is the last thing we want to do, even though we know we should. Okay, so how might you motivate yourself? Maybe get an app or device that will keep you on track. So a fitness watch is great. It can tell you, hey, you haven't moved enough today, so get out and do something. Remind yourself why you need to exercise and be active. So a lot of our ability to be physically active is really mental, right? It's about our desire to do it and encouraging ourselves. So let's say you go out and you want to run that mile, but you get halfway through and you just feel like you are so tired and you just can't do it. You have to talk yourself up so that you can keep going, right? And you can get to the mile. And at the end, you feel very proud of yourself and so accomplished. And then you can check off that vigorous activity box. Do small chunks while doing something else. So I mentioned, doing exercising while you're watching TV. So maybe this might look like something like doing 50 sit-ups during a commercial break, right? Or getting that 15-minute brisk walk in between your work meetings. And then, of course, reward yourself. Non-food rewards, of course, but this might be something like, okay, if I go on my 2-mile walk today, or my 2-mile moderate to vigorous walk, I will treat myself to an hour of my favorite show tonight, or I'm going to go get myself a pedicure, or I'm going to go invite some friends over and have some fun with some friends, right? So motivating yourself, or I might go see that show tonight or that movie or whatever it is, right? Finding something that can motivate you to be active and reward yourself later. Of course, some other barriers to motivating yourself is doing it alone. It's really hard to exercise alone sometimes, especially when we don't want to exercise. So get support. Can you find an accountability partner? Some days you will feel great and motivated to work out, and your accountability partner won't. And other days it'll be the vice versa. So finding someone that will help motivate you and you can motivate them in return. And then I mentioned before, not providing yourself a non-food reward. Okay, so there's something called Girl Trek, which is a sisterhood online that's all about getting Black women across the United States to move more, right? So it's really about getting that 30 minutes of moderate walking or vigorous walking in per day. And it is really blown up into this global movement. So on their website, they've got some stats on their benefits of walking. So as part of this online community. So 61% of the participants reported losing weight, average weight loss of 15 pounds, 90% said that walking, and 90% who had depression diagnosis stated that this improved their, participating in this walking group, improved their symptoms. And there's many other benefits that you can see they've reported: using less medication. They were able to sustain their walking and everything. And then they were inspired to try other activities, right? For some, this is the first, this may have been the first sort of experience with regular physical activity. And then for Black men, there's a group called Black Men Run. This is another movement, but instead of walking, it's to encourage Black men to run regularly. There are, just like Girl Trek, there's different communities throughout every state and every city. Girl Trek, if you go on their website, you can find a community, a local walking group in your community. For Black Men Run, if you go to their website, they have, if you click on this running chapters tab, California, for example, has different running groups, Black men running groups in all of these cities. So if you're looking for a community to partake in some of these exercises, I encourage you to visit these websites. Okay, so then some personal physical barriers might include injuries or other health concerns, right? So you want to consult with your physician if this is the situation for yourself, and starting out slow. Hair. Black women, we know we don't want to get our hair messed up, okay? So we are not trying to sweat it out. We just got our hair done. It is laid. And we are not about to waste all that money that we spent to get our hair done by working out. Even though we know working out is critical for our health, somehow our hair and looking good is more important. So might you be able to wear a protective style? Is there a way you can tie your hair up before you work out? Can you use a cold setting on a hairdryer to dry your hair after you work out, so you're minimizing the frizz, right? So getting around some of those barriers that we commonly use as reasons to not get in our workouts. And then, of course, our physical appearance. Some of us just are not happy with how we look physically and don't want to be in a setting where everybody else, and I'm speaking about at the gym, everyone else who is regularly working out looks amazing, and we feel maybe intimidated. So maybe in those cases, you might choose to work out at home until you start to feel more comfortable, or maybe work out with a friend, go with a friend who will help you feel more confident in those public settings. Okay, your last your last movement break to end our session is to march in place as we go through our concluding slides. Okay, so sometimes you need to check with your physician, like I mentioned, and I just wanted to be a little bit more specific. This is from the Diabetes Prevention Program. They provide a list of some common situations that may lead someone to consult with their physician before partaking in moderate or vigorous activity. So if you're over the age of 50, if you're pregnant, if you tend to be out of breath by just doing light activity, and that means, maybe you did park at the farthest end of the parking lot and you're walking to the store, and by the time you get to the door, you are breathless and you've only walked, 250 feet. You have a health problem, a pre-existing health problem that might need attention and may impact your ability to work out vigorously. Especially if you have any cardiac issues, you definitely want to consult with a physician before you partake in anything moderate or vigorous. You have a bone or joint problem that can be a big hindrance for individuals. And if there's also a way that you can get in physical therapy and find out other exercises or recommendations from a trainer that you can do that will not injure those sites, or that will be easy on the joints or bones. You have chest pains that started recently. This could be for a variety of reasons, but you want to see a physician for that. You tend to pass out or fall dizzy. Certainly go see a physician for that. Or you have pain or pressure, and this is different from just soreness that's typical from, muscle fatigue, right? And then you have high blood pressure or heart problem that you're on medication for, you also want to see a physician for that. So these are some resources you'll receive when the survey goes out. There's a Girl Trek Black Men Run, the diabetes prevention program, which I have plugged in previous webinars. And then there's also some classes that are specific for seniors that you can find in your local city. I know the Active Start class for seniors is through the city of Los Angeles, and they have different programs. And then the Enhanced Fitness is a low-cost fitness program for seniors that some cities also have. So I'll leave you with asking, what are some empowerment actions that you can take? So to get in your recommended 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity, you can start slow, create a realistic goal for the week, right? Maybe you might start by saying, I'm going to do a 20-minute moderate to vigorous walk every single day this week. Or maybe you start just by the day. Don't make a goal for the week. Maybe just make it for the day. You're going to get up that day and talk yourself into doing some type of activity. Maybe it's yoga, maybe it's a run, maybe it's a spin class. Think of creative ways you can get in your 30 minutes of physical activity at home. So maybe you don't really know exactly what types of vigorous activity you can do because you don't have access to a gym, or you don't feel safe walking in your neighborhood or running in your neighborhood. Are there things that you can do at home to get in that physical activity? Find an accountability partner, explore local gyms or online classes, and find a community support group. If you join the DPP program, this what that's all about. And through that, some will actually form their own sort of physical activity group outside of the program sessions, which is always great. All right, so I'll end there and take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Candace. That was great. I have one question in the chat, and I also had just a couple questions that I thought of as you were talking myself. So the question that we have in the Q&A box is, on the checklist, it mentioned if after workouts you have pain in the left shoulder. Why does the checklist highlight the left shoulder?
I don't know exactly. It must be related to a cardiac issue it's related to, but I don't know. I would consult with your physician if that is the situation for yourself.
Okay. Thank you for that. I really, I guess I actually just have more comments than questions. I appreciated you having the tips and tricks in there, the movement breaks. I definitely got up and did some of those, and it made me realize I should be doing more of this. I like the very practical application of like park further. I'm totally guilty of always trying to find the closest parking spot. I will circle around to find the closest parking spot. So thank you for that. I think that that was great. One thing that my mind went to also, I think, is very relatable. I'll walk my dog and be like, okay, check, I did my exercise for the day. But I love that you named that is not really even in the category of being moderate activity. Where my mind went to, and you might have touched on this, but I didn't catch it. If I increase, so if I do, my nice normal pace, just kind of walking my dog through the neighborhood for 60 minutes instead of 30 minutes, does that have a greater impact? Is that, I know it's not, if I'm still walking slowly, it's not like moderate, but does that kind of balance out in any way, for lack of better words?
That's a great question. So if you're walking slowly, then maybe not. But if you're walking at let's say, okay, so I said before, you should be walking for a moderate pace, 15 to 20 minutes, walking a mile for 15 to 20 minutes to get that into that moderate level. So really, you should still be within that range. But if you're on the higher end, at the, let's say 20-minute walking, for each mile, then that would be sufficient and excellent. But if you're walking a mile in 30 minutes, and so by the end of the by the end of the 60 minutes, you've only walked 2 miles, you're still not quite meeting the moderate physical activity recommendation. So that is still excellent, but I would maybe add on 15 minutes of something else that's moderate.
Awesome. That's helpful. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the Q&A box nor in the chat. Does anyone want to come off of mute to share a question? It was really great information. As you were going along, you were answering a lot of the questions that popped into my head. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, physical activity is something that it's harder, I think, than changing diet sometimes, because we all like to eat, and there's so many ways to modify our foods to be healthier, and we feel hungry, right? But we don't always feel the need to move our bodies and get up. We feel the need to sit down and lay down, but we don't always have that signal in our brains like we do for hunger to say, hey, get up and move your body. Now, sometimes you might, because maybe you're so anxious and you just feel restless and you just need to do something. But oftentimes it's not the case, and we just don't want to move. That we don't have that hormonal signal to tell ourselves to move like we do for hunger. So physical activity, achieving those recommendations can be really challenging, especially if it's already not a part of your lifestyle. And so sometimes, you know, having a buddy to do things with is really important, or just changing how you go about your daily activities, like parking further away, or is there a way that you can walk someplace versus driving? Like, let's say you're driving to a park. Might you drive further from the park that you're going to and walk the rest of the way and walk back? So there's just different ways you can be creative about it without it feeling like, oh, I gotta do this workout, or oh my gosh, I gotta get my exercise in, right? Just trying to figure out fun ways, easy ways to incorporate it as part of your daily activity, so it doesn't feel like a job, because sometimes working out does feel like a job. And doing something fun too. So maybe for you, you might do a Zumba class because you like to dance and that's how you want to get your physical activity in. So there's just different things to explore, and sometimes it's finding out what you like to do the best, which oftentimes ends up being aerobic exercises for people. But we also don't want to forget the strength training, which is really important when we're aging, because, you know, especially for Black women, we're at such high risk for osteoporosis. And so when we're lifting weights, we're building our bone strength. And so that's really important for protecting us against that. And, you know, just to emphasize, building muscle strength is also so important for improving insulin sensitivity. And it's a great way to make sure that you're protecting yourself from a decline in your metabolic function. Oh yeah, line dancing classes are definitely lots of fun. Yes, and ballroom dancing, which is on my bucket list.
Awesome. We did have another question come through as you were talking. One of our participants is wondering and stating, I generally ride my stationary bike for 30 minutes each morning. That's equivalent to 7 miles. However, I only burn 90 calories. How does that measure up to the chart that you shared?
So you're exercising for 30 minutes, equivalent to 7 miles, and you're burning 90 calories. That actually does not sound right. If you're in 30, let's see, in 30 minutes, okay, 7 miles should be, I mean, it could be vigorous enough, I think. But if you're only, and I don't know how you're measuring your calorie burns, but you should be burning more than that. It's hard to answer this question without knowing more detail, but usually your caloric, how much you're burning is based off of your age and your body weight and height. And so there's a calculation that's done. So it's hard to answer that, but it sounds like it's not vigorous enough if you're only burning 90 calories. I would maybe shoot for is this a class or just like extra? I don't know if the equipment shows the measurements. Okay. Well, if it's on the equipment, then it's probably accurate. but it sounds like it's not vigorous enough. So you should be burning more than 90 calories. If you're only burning 90 calories in 30 minutes, then you might be more at a moderate intensity level. So I would try to speed up your exercising on the bike. And that can also look like intervals. So maybe for some of the ride, the beginning of the ride, you're doing slower, moderate pace cycling, and then you increase the intensity, then you go back down to moderate and go up to high intensity, et cetera. And you can do the same thing when you're running or walking as well. If you're measuring your heart, so you should actually be measuring your heart rate while you're doing the activity, because you're trying to get a percentage of your max heart rate. So if you're, for example, if you're just doing moderate activity and you're trying to meet that 50% maximum heart rate, you need to measure it while you're doing the activity, because if you measure it at the end, your heart rate should be coming down a little bit. So you want to have a heart rate monitor. You want to wear that while you're doing the exercise. Yes, adjusting the tension is critical. So if you're not adjusting tension, then you're not getting the best bang for your buck. You're making it too easy on yourself. It's like the equivalent of walking. When we're not really pushing ourselves to walk fast, we're not, like Amber mentioned, she's still in that light activity range. So adjusting tension and speeding up. When you're not doing high tension, then you want to do a lot of fast speeds. If you're at a high tension, you want to do a moderate speed.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Price. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So at this time, we will transition to sharing out future webinars that we've got coming up as part of our Health for Life series. So our next session will be September 7th. Session number 5 will focus on sleep, your body, and diabetes risk. Earlier in the day at 12 p.m., we will also have our Caring for the Caregiver series happening on September 7th. Session 6 of this series will be happening same time, 5 o'clock on September 21st. Our final session of this series, which will not be hosted by Dr. Price, and we will miss you, will focus on smoking cessation, and we're aiming to host that one on October 5th so that it remains in the cadence of having these sessions every other week. And then I'm really excited to share that we are going to be having a Health for Life series on the Non-Toxic Black Beauty Project. That is coming up on Thursday, October 19th, and that will also be at 12 p.m. So save the date for all of those. And of course, all of those webinars will be found on our events page and require separate registration. Finally, going to that page of our social media. We'll go back one. My apologies, having them a little out of order there, Ambria. Thank you. Here we are. So these are our social media platforms. We are on Instagram and Facebook at Your CBHN. We are on LinkedIn at the California Black Health Network. You can find us on Twitter at Your CBHN. And I included our YouTube channel, which is California Black Health Network 3312. I did copy and paste that exactly. So I see that the R and the K are not on there. I'm going to be sending out all of our links that were included on the resource slide, as well as sending out a reminder of how to connect with us on social media with our survey. And at this time, if we don't have anything else, I do see a hand in the chat. I know that we're a little bit over, but we've had so much great information. I wonder, are we able to unmute? We've got one participant with a hand raised, Ambria. Thank you. Mr. Elliott, you are able to unmute.
Yes, I'm sorry for the late question. Is there a way we can view previous sessions 1 through 3?
Yes, absolutely. That is going to be available on our YouTube channel, and I will send those out in follow-up to today's session as well.
Thank you very much. This was an awesome session.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to everyone, and have a great evening and a wonderful weekend. Thank you especially to you, Dr. Price.